Hello and welcome to another Crazy Car Projects. Today's a little different. We've had about a week and a half or 2 weeks of really cold weather, snow, sub-zero, so we haven't been able to get much done outside on any of the vehicles. But I thought this would be a good opportunity to cover some information and some things that's good to do when you have hard cold weather like this. Anytime in particular it gets below 20, not just below freezing. Anytime you have below freezing, you need to make sure that your coolant has sufficient coolant in it so it's not going to freeze, and your windshield washer fluid has something in it to help it keep from freezing. You can buy winter fluid, you can buy winter additive. If you have a diesel, you got to think on keeping it from gelling, so you'll need to either have winter formula or add winter additive to it. But as it gets colder, it gets even more extreme on that stuff. You have to think on some of the older engines and stuff on what viscosity of oil you're using in them, because there are some, especially like some of the old truck engines and stuff, that you use a heavy oil in during the summer. You've got to use a lighter oil and change it out before it gets below 20 degrees or 10 degrees, or the engine runs the risk of, well, the oil's not going to circulate, so it's going to destroy the engine. You also run into some problems with transmission fluid, especially on some manuals. I've noticed even in my Yaris on the fact that the oil is getting old, and it was thick and retarded shifts and didn't really want to flow well when it got down to below zero. So it kind of told me that yes, I need to go in and change the fluid in the manual transmission. Even though manual transmissions don't have to have the same service generally as a automatic transmission, they still do need service. You can run the same thing with an automatic. Some of the fluids get older, especially if you have a automatic transmission you've added a stabilizer or thickener into. When you get into extreme cold, when it's below 10, below zero, in the minus 10, minus 20, sometimes that fluid will get so heavy that the transmission can't operate correctly. Big ones you have to watch for on vehicles just getting ready for cold is checking your coolant, checking your windshield washer fluid, because if you have something that won't stand up to the temperature you're getting to, there's a good chance you're going to bust the bottle and the pump, because it'll freeze, expand, and pop it. You need to watch what you have in your car, such as if you have water or sodas or stuff. They may freeze and bust, especially anything like a soda in a can. Some of your additives, your car additives, that kind of stuff, some of that stuff sensitive, especially anything that's in a spray can. It not know so much that it may freeze, but it may go inert when it gets cold enough. It'll quit. It denatures what's in it, and it just doesn't function properly. You also have to watch for some of, we had an issue with one of the radios on one of the vehicles. The liquid crystal screen froze. Luckily it didn't damage the screen, but the screen didn't work properly when you turned the car on because the liquid crystals were frozen. It thawed, and luckily it didn't damage anything, but it was something that you don't really think on normally, and that's a more modern issue, because it's not something you really think about for a radio if you drive an older vehicle, or even with some of the newer vehicles. This was an aftermarket, so it's one of those, you have an aftermarket with some of the displays. You may want to check and see what your display is and whether or not it has a temperature rating. You have some things that are good tricks, especially with the diesel. It's pretty common that you block off the radiator feed so it'll warm up better. You can find when it gets extremely cold, especially minus 20, minus 30, in that range, even with a gas engine, you may need to do that just to get the engine to operate at a proper temperature so it'll run properly and so you can get some heat in the cab. It's less of an issue with most modern vehicles. It's a bigger issue when you're driving something old. It's something I've had to do with a Jeep before, an old Jeep, which was really fun because it didn't even have a heater. So it was just trying to get the engine to come to temp out of cold because it was clattering. You end up with Also, fuel. Even gasoline, if it gets cold enough, can congeal. So if you're somewhere where it's extreme cold, you have to think, if you're traveling north to Alaska or northern Canada or something for something, and you may end up being there during temperature with your vehicle, you need to make sure that you have everything set, including your fuel, because even gasoline will gel when it gets cold enough. And any junk you have in a filter or something like that can become more problematic as it gets cold, especially with diesels, where if you have a moisture catch. Those things you need to make sure you drain and watch them, because if it's catched enough moisture and it freezes, it can pop seals on those or pop lines and cause problems. So it's just stuff you don't normally think about until you get into extreme colds. You run into some stuff similar with extreme heat, but not near to the extent. And with extreme heat, I think it's a little easier to think about. You're generally dealing with overheating and vapor. With extreme cold, you have to think on the fact that stuff will not just freeze, but some things will become thicker and just not flow like they need to. Something else you have to think about as it gets cold is it's very hard on batteries. And it doesn't really matter what kind of battery you're using. All batteries suffer in cold. Some suffer more than others. An older battery is going to suffer more. Traditional lead acid battery is going to suffer a little more than some of the more modern technology batteries, just because of the contents in it, the fact that you have liquid in them, water in them. But all of them suffer in cold. They get weaker. They have more trouble producing the current, and the colder it gets, the worse it'll be. So you have to think about keeping the battery charged, having a way to jump it if you really need to, having a keeper on it, potentially. If you're doing something in cold weather, a vehicle you don't run every day, sometimes you want to put a battery keeper on it. That way it will keep it charged. It actually kind of helps keep the battery a little warmer too, so it functions a little better. You have some vehicles that have engine plug-ins. That can be an engine heater. Some of them actually help maintain. I've seen setups where it helps maintain power in the vehicle. So if you have that, you may want to use that. Another issue you run into is people worry about what to do when things freeze, when your key lock freezes, when your windows freeze up, when your doors freeze shut. Something people talk about doing that's really not good to do is pouring hot or boiling water on it. That causes thermal shock. You run the chance of busting glass, popping metal. You can do a lot of damage causing thermal shock. You're a lot better off doing it with just water it's warmer than freezing, but that or rubbing alcohol. You can do some with different lubricants and stuff. They'll still warm it up. They'll help thaw it out. They'll make it move. And you're not going to have that thermal shock where it causes metal to warp or glass to pop or plastic to pop. It's really pretty bad with plastic components and cheap pot metal stuff, as well as the glass, for thermal shock causing things to pop and crack. The other thing you're going to run into is don't force stuff. I've even had the baffles for the heat freeze shut before on a vehicle, and you can't force it. If that switch isn't going to move in the controls, don't force it. You're going to break something. Just give it time to warm up and let it thaw. You want to let the engine run for a little while and warm up before you start, or you put a lot of pressure on it, because everything's thicker. It needs to warm up. It can do more damage to the moving parts if you don't let it warm a little bit before you start off. Just because things aren't going to move as well, plus metal and components can be more brittle in the cold. And another thing you got to watch for is tire pressures, because as temperature drops, the pressure may drop in your tires, is likely to drop in your tires. So as it gets cold, you may need to check and pump up your tires more. You also need to watch if you're driving in ice and snow, you may want the pressure down a little bit on your tires. It's going to be a little dependent on the vehicles, but having a little less pressure in your tires can greatly improve your traction and reduce the chance of not being able to get grip with your tires. You just need to be careful with it, and don't ever think that because you have special tires or you have a four-wheel drive or anything like that, that you don't need to worry about slick conditions, because that just helps you get going. It's not going to solve the problem if you lose traction, and it's not necessarily going to prevent you from losing traction when you're moving. Something else you have to think about with slick conditions, ice conditions in particular, if you have a short wheelbase vehicle, that short wheelbase makes the vehicle more susceptible to a spin out or a slide in icy conditions because you have a shorter footprint. So there's a higher chance that all four wheels will hit ice. Also, you have less stability in a straight line, so it takes less for it to start into a spin. So when you're driving a short wheelbase vehicle such as my Yaris, you have to just think on that and remember that, okay, if you're coming to a spot that may have slickness, you may want to slow it down a little extra before. You'll need to think if there's a curve, you may need to do even a little bit more than you would, say, in a long sedan or something like that, or a minivan. Just because of that shorter wheelbase, if you do find something slick, it's going to react to it more extremely than the longer vehicle normally would. Another thing you need to think about for driving is what kind of drivetrain you have. Manual, automatic, all-wheel drive, front-wheel drive, rear-wheel drive, they all act differently. And if you have something with rear-wheel drive in particular, but anything, you got to think about also the weight of the vehicle and the weight in the back compared to the weight in front. You may want to add additional weight to the rear of a vehicle, even if it's front-wheel drive or all-wheel drive, just to help with traction and stability. But that's if you're dealing with slick conditions and harder conditions. If you're trying to get through loose packed snow, then you're not necessarily going to want the extra weight. Then you're going to want to have, wider pattern on your tires, so that's lower air, that type, and you don't want to have to drive very far that way. It's one of those things. Unless you're doing trail stuff can be fun, but if you're having to travel that way, you may want to consider where you're going and whether you can wait. And that's really the main thing. That goes into some extreme stuff, some other stuff, and there's all kinds of other things for dealing with cold and snow and ice and everything, but those were the big ones. Another one I will mention is with ice, something you can do to help keep the windshield from getting iced up and to keep the windshield wipers from being frozen to the windshield is you can put like a plastic garbage bag over it between the windshield and the wipers. That'll help you get the ice off. I've also seen where I've actually done this before, where I've done the plastic under and then a plastic over. That way the over one pulls the ice off of both, and whatever gets through is stopped by the second one. I've had to do that a few times when I had ice storms coming through. You can also do it and do it to cover the top. If you have a tarp to do it, you might toss a tarp over your car, and that'll keep you from having your doors and everything frozen shut. But that's going to be partly dependent also on what the wind's going to be doing and whether you can tie it down if you have a tarp. Well, that's all I've got for this one. Try to stay warm out there, and like, share, and subscribe, and hopefully next week we'll have more car repair. Have a good one.